then I'll share my screen with you. We shall begin. We shall commence. Okay. One moment. Okay, can you see the slide only, or my comments as
Good,
well?
it's good, Effie. It's good.
Okay. All right. So I'd like about 20 years ago, I had a long conversation with my mother's aging aunt, Janka. My mother's family came from the small Slovak town of Topolchany. My grandfather, Edward Kutcher, immigrated to Palestine in the early 1930s. Um, all four of his siblings followed before World War II. His parents, however, didn't want to leave. During the war, the Slovak state, part of the Axis powers during World War II, um, organized the deportation of most of its Jewish citizens to German occupied Poland into the death camps, uh, mostly by the Linke Guard and regular policemen aiding the SS in this venture. All the family members who still lived in Topolchany shared this fate, and most of them were murdered in the Nazi concentration camps in Poland. Only a few of the survivors returned to their hometown from the Nazi death camps, mostly from Majdanek and Auschwitz-Birkenau, after the liberation. One of these relatives wrote to the four siblings in Palestine in the summer of 1945, announcing his arrival back from the death camps and also telling the family what had happened. But after three or four letters, the correspondence ended abruptly. When my mother's Aunt Janka started digging into this matter, she found out about the events of September 1945 in Topolchany. On the morning of September 24th, um, women demonstrated against the nationalization of the local school, blaming the Jewish teachers uh, were replacing the nuns and that the Jews were destroying Christian religious objects. That same day, a local Jewish doctor, a man called Dr. Karol Berger, happened to be in that same school vaccinating 8-year-old children, and he was accused by the same mothers of injecting the children with poisoned blood with the intention of poisoning the non Jewish children. These rumors sparked riots during which about 200 or 300 people, the women and people who joined them, um, attacked local Jews and beat them. All of them were survivors from the camps who had arrived in town over the past few months after the liberation. The police seemed to be unable to prevent the events, and some Czechoslovak army soldiers who were called from the local garrison were asked to help, but most of them actually joined the mob. 47 Jews were injured, and 15 had been hospitalized, some in critical condition. International media coverage embarrassed the Czechoslovak authorities, and the Czechoslovak Communist Party exploited the riots to accuse the democratic authorities of Czechoslovakia of ineffectiveness. The events in Topolchany had, of course, a greater effect than the significance just for the people directly affected by the pogrom, because it became a staple of post war anti Semitism in Slovakia. One of those badly injured in the riots was that family member who corresponded with Aunt Janka. He never recovered from his injuries and died in hospital as a result of the beating. In October of 2005, in an act of reconciliation, Topolchany mayor Pavel Segesh, born after the riots, publicly turned to the Slovak Jewish community, acknowledged the acts, and asked for forgiveness. He could not turn to the Topolchany Jewish community because it never survived. No Jew was left in Topolchany after these events. As Professor Magda Teter writes in the epilogue to her book, Blood Libel on the Trail of an Anti-Semitic Myth, although during the course of time between the medieval and early modern period, the deadly blood libels might have waned, they did not disappear. Accusations and trials continued in the 19th and 20th centuries, and in 1946, the persistent myth triggered a pogrom that left more than 40 Poland. I'm sorry. Hold on. The events I just mentioned in Topolčany, Slovakia, occurred almost a year before the events mentioned by Magda in Kilice in July 1946. The recent events of January 6th in the United States, laced by the very strong anti-Semitic overtones from the QAnon conspiracy theorists, only strengthen Magda's conclusion in her book. We are not living in medieval times, but similar and parallel accusations still circulate in the 21st century, equivalent of the printed pamphlets that aided in the disseminating of blood libel accusations. Social media and darknet websites are still filled with hate and hints and direct accusations about Jewish involvement in heinous crimes and ritual abuse of innocent Christian children. For this reason, this book is so important, and it is timely as ever that we here at the Center for the Study of Conversion and Interreligious Encounters in Ben-Gurion University in Beersheba thought it most fitting to honor Magda and the book. Our first speaker will be the author, Professor Magda Teter. She holds the Schvidler Chair in Jewish History at Fordham University. Magda is the author of 3 acclaimed books: Jews and Heretics in Catholic Poland, Sinners on Trial, Jews and Sacrilege After the Reformation, and now her recent book, Blood Libel on the Trail of an Anti-Semitic Myth. She's also an author of numerous articles on Jewish-Christian relations, especially but not exclusively in the early modern Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Having delved deeply into the topic of crime, my personal favorites from her many articles are Crime and Sacred Space in Early Modern Poland, that came out about 10 years ago, and an article she had published together with my colleague Ted Frem, who's also present here tonight, in the AJS Review, Apostasy, Fraud, and the Beginning of the Hebrew Printing Press in Krakow, about the first Jewish and later Christian brothers, Samuel Asher and Eliakim Helitz, who started a printing press in Krakow in the 1530s. The other speakers will be Dr. Milan Zonsha from Charles University in Prague, and Dr. Sophia Schmidt, who graduated from Ludwig Maximilians University in Munich, and who was also a fellow here at the Center for the Study of Conversion last year in a group that worked on violence and religious violence in the 3 Abrahamic religions. The concluding remarks will be by Professor Miri Rubin from Queen Mary University in London, who by now classic books Corpus Christi, the Eucharist in Late Medieval Culture, and Gentile Tales, the Narrative Assault on Late Medieval Jews, have a very strong bearing on tonight's topic. I will also mention 2 of my personal favorites from Miri's bookshelf, and it's literally a bookshelf, Mother of God, A History of the Virgin Mary, and her recent book, which is an absolute must-read, Cities of Strangers, Making a Living in Medieval Europe. And at this, I conclude my opening remarks, and I hand it over to Professor Magda Teter. Please.
Thank you so much, Effie, for this great and generous introduction and very moving recounting of the events in Slovakia. I am really honored to be here, and I am really honored by all of you who have come here. There are so many of you from whom I've learned, with whom I've worked, and it's really wonderful to see you here. I'm going to, the Zoom phrase, I'm going to share my screen now with you. What I thought I'd do today with you, I'll share and not just what the book is about, but also about how it came about. When I started the book, I didn't intend to make it such a brick. It was actually quite concisely conceived, and it was a fairly historically confined project. I did not think of making any arrays to present, and at the time, except for Sarah Palin's mention of blood libel in 2011 or something like that, there was really no immediate relevancy of the story as it turned out to be later. So it's one of those things, who knows what this book would have been if I had finished earlier as I planned. But I want to just show you how it started and where it went. When I first, I want to tell you how I came to even think about it, but when I finally sort of came to structure it in 2011, it only had 6 chapters. It was fairly focused on actually Poland and the early modern period, because that's when anti-Jewish accusations like that were in Poland. And the medieval period was really just a kind of an introductory background. I thought I'd have to deal with it. Trent was going to be, again, the sort of introductory background. I had no intention to spend more time on it than just mention that it existed. And really the focus was on trying to understand why these accusations were taking place in Poland in the early modern period, to the extent that they were taking place. And when you look at the last chapter, proposed return to the medieval policies in the era on enlightenment, this is the warning how assumptions can be totally wrong when you start your project. So my thought was that, okay, after 1540, we stopped having defenses of Jews by the popes, by Rome, but then we have the Ganganelli report, and then things are coming back maybe to some of these policies of protection. Was I ever wrong on that? But that was only clear once I got into the archives and I began to unravel both the documents, but also the thread of the story. So I started really looking back from the Ganganelli report, and it began to take me into areas of Italy. The Jews are deemed innocent in the tribunals of Italy. That's the phrase from his report about the trials of Jews in Italy in the 18th century. So it became clear that it would be interesting to look at why the seat and the Catholic domains in Italy where Jews were accused but were defended, but what was happening in Poland was quite different. But of course, when I started looking at the Italian cases, I entered into the Sephardic trail of apologetics and polemic against blood accusations. So once I started reading all those Sephardic works, polemical works, then I began to look for Ashkenazi literary responses. And once I started reading the Ashkenazi literary responses, I realized I really needed to go more deeply into the medieval period, because many of those Ashkenazi tropes of martyrdom were the ones that really carried through into these medieval, early modern songs and tales. And that's how this book began to grow into the 10 chapters that it eventually was published as I submitted in 2018. And it became very clear that the story of Simon of Trent was one of the key stories for at least the Christian transmission and somewhat less so for the Jewish responses and literary responses and diplomatic responses, but it became an important thread. But just to show you how I didn't really think about it, I was finishing up, tying my loose ends for the second book on sacrilege, and I finished it, and I had nothing else to do, but I was in the secret Vatican archives, now Apostolic Vatican archives, and I said, well, what am I to do? Let me just pull out the Trent records and look at that. So I requested the volume of the trial records from the Jews of Trent, and these are my notes. This is all I've written in 2010, looking at it. This is a beautiful manuscript in parchment, 120 folios. This is a Latin version of trial. Each person's testimony is dealt with one by one. Not useful for me, but needs to have seen. I clearly wasn't thinking that this was going to be ever relevant to what I was doing, and it was not something that I was planning on doing. But this story became very, very crucial, and it became key in understanding that blood libel, though conceived as a medieval accusation, was really an early modern phenomenon and was really rooted in European imagination and the early modern period. Like many of you, I also thought of this as a pretty much medieval, and manifestations of that in Poland. Although I began to think in already 2004 at the early modern workshop that this is has something to do with early modernity, at least in Poland. And so this is from the book has a website and has interactive maps. These are slides, but you can play with it on the website. And it became clear that there is a qualitative and quantitative difference between the medieval, which I roughly end in 1450, and the early modern period. For one thing, there are fewer of the stories in the medieval period, and they are mostly transmitted through literary sources. Very few official legal documents survive. And then in the early modern period, there are not only more of those stories, but they are documented through some kind of official paper trail, whether official responses or actual court records. And one of the things that was, what is interesting is Ronnie Shah's book from, I think 1988, The Myth of Ritual Murder, obviously talked about the waning of the accusation. But he stopped on, his work was focused on Germany, and he didn't look east at Poland, where in fact, this is the height of these accusations. And in the book, I really explain why we see the height of those accusations and why in 1590s and not so much before. There are just few after 1590 of those cases in Western Europe. There are 4 instances in Italy. None of them have ended with a conviction of Jews, and the only one was in Metz, the trial of Raphael Levy, and that was a separate story of how, borderland, and again I discuss it in my book in detail. One of the other things that became interesting is how these outcomes, when we think about the popular memory or imagination of what the blood libels were, we always think about that Jews were killed. And in the medieval period, at least in the stated outcomes, again, our sources are mostly literary, the majority of the cases that are said that there is an outcome say yes, and then there are unknown and no Jews were survived. But in the early modern period, it changes a little bit. We have the majority, although we have this proliferation, there is also a majority of those cases that actually in which Jews were not prosecuted or were released or were deemed innocent, including in Poland. But these are not the stories that enter the public paper trail, because many of those I'm sorry, this is okay, I know, because many of the stories that enter chronicles and the public knowledge, and I'll show you in a moment, were the ones that focus on Jews being killed and executed and punished for those supposed crimes. The other thing that was interesting is, again, the initial question that I had about the role of papal defenses. So this is the period when between the first papal defense of Jews against these accusations in 1274, following the death of the girl in Valréas in Provence, and 1540, which was the last one really ever issued papal defense of Jews, and this was for Jews of Poland and Hungary and Bohemia. So again, you have for Poland, you have only literary sources of some tales. The other cases are in sort of Western Europe. After when the papal defenses stopped, we see a massive shift, and I saw it in the court records, where the silence from Rome, and Jews several times went to Rome seeking renewal even of those medieval bulls or the 1540 bull, to no avail. That the silence from Rome was in fact in Polish courts by accusers considered proof that Jews were considered guilty by the Pope, and it was only amplified by the fact that the story of Simon of Trent has entered into widespread types of genre accessible to European readers. So it became very clear that that story is far more important, that it is, as some scholars have earlier, quite pivotal in this, not just because of the use of print, but how it then entered the sort of epistemological ecosystem of European intellectuals. And so it begins to develop the iconographic vocabulary for how we imagine the blood libel. It begins to have a full narrative that is produced right at the beginning of the trial, before even full interrogations have taken place. The narrative is set and disseminated through print. The attraction and the use of Trent as a pilgrimage site and dissemination of the story through that mode, and again the use of imagery and story together, which is also important in the history of the printed book. This is the first instance where images actually are not generic but correspond directly to the story told on the page, and this is one of the first such picture books that is ever published in Europe of Simon of Trent being kidnapped and then, as the story says, supposedly martyred by Jews, and then what happens is that it enters the liturgy and liturgical calendar of the Catholic Church, which is seen as an implicit recognition that Jews were in fact guilty of such crimes. And in Poland, it became a proof in court records. I actually was able to find references to the lives of saints that mention Simon as proof of their guilt. So this is what we see in after Simon of Trent is recognized, his cult is finally in the 1580s recognized by the Pope, and we see this again proliferation of the trials in Poland in legal settings. You probably know this image from the Schädel's Weltchronik. This from 1474. This story enters chronicles, and so even people who are not interested in reading about Jews or couldn't care less about Jews, but were interested in history, and this is a relatively new, widespread genre, world history. They encountered stories about Jews, about a dozen of those stories, but several of them about Jews killing Christian children, and Simon was very prominently featured in these stories. That particular image is entirely forgotten. Other types of anti-Jewish imagery, the sort of depicting Jews as really horrific, cruel people, is developed in north of the Alps. And here you have several examples on this I like to give, because this image was far more frequently republished than the image we're all familiar with now from Schädel's Chronicle. And here is the William of Norwich, again entering the ecosystem of historical knowledge that Europeans consumed. Sebastian Münster's Chronicle, he is an interesting example because he's a Protestant, he's a Hebraist, and yet he still nonetheless included and transmitted those stories in his book. What was also, and this is what perhaps something that I would not have thought about had I finished my book earlier, was that I did not, I was not interested in the modern uses of blood libel at all. But then with the rise of neo-Nazis and including, as my book was going to print, the Poway synagogue shooting in San Diego, in which the shooter invoked Simon of Trent as one of the reasons why he was engaged in killing Jews, made me realize that there is this contemporary relevance of these stories and how these stories became fully rooted. So one of the things that I noticed was the language, and this is in every single chronicle you go through. These are the stories that Europeans consumed. And we realized that we've been asking the wrong question. The question was not why people believed in this thing, knowing that Jews couldn't consume blood and all those things. But the question was, why are we surprised that they believed in it when all they could read, all the knowledge that they had was accessible to them, transmitted those stories. In the modern period, and this is why this tale becomes relevant, the story is resurrected, and iconography is resurrected by the Nazis. That is, in the 19th century, there are some accusations that are framed differently, and Hillel Kieval's book is going to tell us more about it. But it is the Nazis who are actually turning to those early modern sources and chronicles and early modern iconography, and are using it to spread their anti-Semitic propaganda. Here you have, in the circle that I did by hand, you can see the sort of 3 pages of these historical instances that exactly cite the chronicles that I've been examining. And this is really the route in which the contemporary neo-Nazis and white supremacists get their knowledge about those stories. But once it entered the Nazi ecosystem, it entered all the other European anti-Semitic literature, including in Poland during the height of the killings and murder of Jews there. And this, I think, is one of the reasons why that myth becomes so much activated in the after-war period. But I am not, again, this is more scholars of modern Poland and war period that will be able to say more about it. So just quickly, other lessons to be learned. One is that leadership matters. That is, those statements by the popes did matter. They didn't prevent accusations, but they mattered because they served as defense mechanisms. And again, we could see that in the way it was used in and the proliferation of the accusations between in the period when these bulls were available versus when they were not available. That the sources of knowledge matter, and that, I think, came to me. I saw it, but it became very clear during the 2016 election, when people were asking why so many Americans believed these lies and stories that were not fake news, right? That were not true. And the confirmation bias theories began to be articulated and more broadly following the election. And this is exactly what comes out of my early modern sources, that what we read makes a difference how we think. So we had this German polyphony of these sort of polemical ethnographic works that have been studied by a number of scholars that really helped. They were polemical, they were anti-Jewish, but helped debunk the myth. Bookstore said matzah, it's just water and flour, and he makes this sly comment saying it doesn't even taste good. But there's nothing they say about blood. So that helped, even though the iconography and even though the anti-Jewish language was there, it helped diffuse that accusation. In Italy, despite Simon of Trent, the interest of the literary work was conversion and really theological debates over Messiah and the truths of Christianity. And that really dominated the literature in Italy related to Jews. This was very different in Poland. In Poland, when really literature related to Jews enters the scene, it is predominantly anti-Jewish, drawn on these chronicles and the stories in these chronicles that I showed you that emphasize the terrible things Jews do. And that, I think, I argue, has a very clear impact on the way the accusations are taking place and the outcomes of those accusations. And final point, and I'll yield my screen, is the visual culture matter. So in Italy, despite the stories of Salman of Trent and despite the early iconography, the iconography that begins to dominate the Italian sphere is the iconography of the Simon to whom you worship, the sort of blessed boy. And here are two examples from the 16th century. It is in the northern and then later on Eastern Europe that we see the proliferation of iconography that focus on the act of killing and the cruelty of Jews. And that, again, has an impact on later conceptions about Jews, who they are, whether they belong, and then the way modern anti-Semitism develops. So I'll stop here and yield my floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Magda. Thank you. Our next speaker for tonight is Dr. Milan Zonsha. Milan is a lecturer of Hebrew Studies since 2016. He's been a member of the academic board of the Prague Center for Jewish Studies. He completed his dissertation in 2015 at Queen Mary under the supervision of Professor Miri Rubin. And in that dissertation, he examined the intellectual diversity of Jewish communities in late medieval and Central and Eastern Europe. He's written about these matters, and to the best of my knowledge, his book on imagined communities of Yom Tov Lippmann, Mühlhausen heresy, and communal boundaries in Sefer Nitzachon uh, is about to appear. And without further ado, I give you Dr. Milan Zonsha. And unmute yourself, please, Milan, before you start.
Okay, can you hear me? Thank you. Thank you very much, Effie, for the invitation to participate in this discussion about Magda Teter's impressive and stimulating book, Blood Libel on the Trail of an Anti-Semitic Myth. I believe this volume is an important contribution to our understanding of the role of anti-Jewish stereotypes in early modern cultural imagination and the dynamic of their dissemination. The book brings up a number of incisive points, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to discuss some of its key themes. In her analysis of the reactions of different actors to blood libel accusations, both reported and experienced on the ground, Magda draws attention not only to the political, but also to the epistemological underpinnings of these accusations. Using a detailed analysis of numerous examples across early modern Europe, the book shows how new media not only made it easier for narratives of alleged Jewish atrocities committed against Christian children to reach new and wider audiences, but it also illustrates how these media created so-called epistemological landscapes where these narratives were perceived as believable and authoritative. It illustrates how early modern ethnographers and intellectuals, selectively applying a particular epistemological filter, were able to manipulate the first-hand experiences of their Christian co-religionists by their claims to expertise. The dismembered bodies of Christian knowledge concerning past accusations, as well as Jewish belief and rituals, were assembled into narratives that portrayed the inexorably violent nature of the Jews as an established fact. These points are pertinent not only to our understanding of the early modern cultural landscape, but also to broader and more contemporary concerns. Claims to interpretative authority and strategies aimed at manipulating the experience of reality are essential to any theory claiming to uncover a nefarious conspiracy. One could say that conspiracy theories, be it ancient, medieval, early, or postmodern, are anxiety-driven exercises in applied hermeneutics. In their attempt to uncover unsavory cabals, adherents of conspiracy theories hunt for allusions, puns, traces of information that could endow a particular social conflict, natural occurrence, or simply an implausible phenomenon with deeper meaning. Those who produce and consume conspiratorial fantasies use fragments of knowledge as cogs and springs to construct interpretive contraptions, and by connecting scattered dots, create simulacra pretending to be faithful reflections of the structure of reality. Both the expert knowledge we all rely on a day-to-day basis and the pernicious conspiratorial mindset are born exactly at this intersection of assumed authority and interpretive acts that claim to reveal relations and meaning beyond what is on the surface. To use a well-known and particularly relevant example from 2016, an anonymous Twitter user claimed to have authoritative insider knowledge of an ongoing FBI investigation uncovering a conspiratorial ring of child abusers and sex traffickers tied to Bill and Hillary Clinton and other prominent Democratic Party members. For weeks, Users on internet message boards scoured leaked emails of Clinton campaign strategist John Podesta in an attempt to break the code they believe these messages contained, to uncover and reveal the true extent of atrocities committed on innocent children. Each reference to food or ordinary activity became for them an allusion to child trafficking. The alleged headquarters of this satanic sex abuse, Comet Ping Pong Pizza in Washington, D.C., was deemed to refer to the conspiracy in its logo, containing rather innocuous crescents and stars. And even the name of the restaurant's owner, James Alefantis, was taken by some to be a punning allusion to the French phrase, j'aime les enfants, I like children. 3 months later, these hermeneutic exercises became all too real when a North Carolina man entered the restaurant with a semi-automatic rifle in an attempt to self-investigate the whole matter. However, let us not dwell too much on our present anxieties concerning children and politics. Rather, let us examine briefly how Professor Magda Teter's analysis of the motifs that came to full expression in the early modern period can also illuminate our understanding of the medieval development of the blood libel. What role did expert knowledge disseminated through various media and claims to interpretive authority play in medieval accusations against the Jews? And how were these claims materialized and disseminated? More specifically, I would like to explore and suggest that it was the growing presence, both physical and literary, of Jewish converts to Christianity who were able and willing to act as figures of authority and provide insider knowledge about Jewish literature and ritual, combined with the transformation of the ways Christian intellectuals conceptualized the relationship between Judaism and Christianity, especially as their concerns, anxieties, and devotional practices made them more attuned to fantasize about Jewish religious practice, ritual, and its deleterious influence on Christian bodies and souls. In his excellent study of medieval depictions of religious conversion, Ryan Speech has examined how these narratives served as means of establishing their authors' auctoritas. Analyzing texts by converts such as Herman of Cologne, Peter Alfonsi, and Abner of Burgos, Speech argues that they construct religious conversion as a hermeneutical journey, a quest from wrong to correct interpretation of one's religious tradition and ultimately of one's life. In this way, the convert not only embodied the spirit of figurative allegory and temporal progression characteristic of Christian understanding of history, but, and perhaps more importantly for our purposes, drew the attention of the reader to Jewish authorities and their correct interpretation. I quote, "With this dual identity, the convert is able to bridge the divide between the desire for authenticity and the need for intrinsic worth by bringing original Hebrew authorities out of the shadows of radical difference, back into position of distant but manageable familiarity, both present and absent in the same discourse, both conjured up at the same time they are conjured away." End of quote. The ability of converts to conjure up Hebrew texts and rituals only to subsequently conjure them away, again, is demonstrated in their involvement in 13th century Jewish-Christian polemics. Christian preoccupation with Jewish post-biblical literature, so thoroughly analyzed by Amos Finkelstein, Jeremy Cohen, or Robert Chazen, to name just a few, involved converts who publicly exposed the hate speech they believed Jewish texts and rituals contained and called for their censor or destruction. Alternatively, they believed these texts contained proofs of Christian dogma and challenged Jewish authorities to accept this interpretation. In both cases, the contribution of converts such as Nicolas Donin, who was involved in the Talmud trial in Paris in 1240, or Paul Christian, who debated Nachmanides in Barcelona in 1263, consisted not only in the fact that they drew the attention of Christian religious authorities to previously unknown Jewish texts, but also and perhaps more importantly, that they publicly assumed the authority to interpret them. The preserved Hebrew narratives of both the Talmud trial and the Barcelona disputation show that both Yechiel of Paris and Nachmanides saw the challenge presented by their interlocutors as primarily a hermeneutical one. The former argued that the problematic passages in the Talmud do not refer to Jesus or Christians, while the latter challenged the Christological interpretation of Talmudic Agadah as methodologically impossible. It has been repeatedly acknowledged, most recently by Alexander Fedora, that these convert initiatives were from the outset collaborative projects with heavy Christian involvement. The newly assumed authority of converts, rooted in earlier conversion narratives, clearly stimulated the interest of Christian intellectuals and church authorities in Jewish ritual and its interpretation. This authority is further exemplified in Emperor Frederick's willingness to assemble a board of Jewish converts to Christianity to examine the blood libel against the Jews of Fulda in 1235. Thus, by the mid-13th century, contemporary Jewish practices have been opened to the scrutiny of Christian scholars. However, they were not approached with ethnographic, but rather exegetical interest. Jewish ritual became a subject of Christian hermeneutics, to be interpreted in relation to Christian belief. One particularly powerful rite of passage, which brings together the symbolically and emotionally charged motifs of violence, bloodshed, identity formation, and rebirth, is circumcision. In her recent book, Paula Tartakov explores medieval Christian discussions of circumcision, and especially the construction of Jews as agents of apostasy to Judaism. She shows that these constructions were inherently connected with Christian concerns about the instability of religious identity, and fears that Christians are too prone to be manipulated by the influence of infidels, not only Jews, but also Muslims or Christian heretics. Tartakov highlights the bidirectionality of Jewish Christian conversion and its fluid nature. Christian constructions of Jews as agents of apostasy were shaped by both fact and fantasy, and medieval anxieties about the fragility of Christian identity, as well as by social reality of Jewish attempts to re-Judaize some Jewish converts to Christianity, or even seize the children who had been baptized. She examines the case of an alleged forced circumcision taking place in the 1230s in Norwich, England, its legal underpinnings, and shows how it was later explicitly narrated as an attempted ritual murder, a prelude to ritual crucifixion. Contemplating the dangers circumcision could pose to non-Jews further stimulated Christian interest in Jewish ritual and interpretation. At least some medieval Jews believed in the redemptive power of the blood of circumcision, as attested by the custom to spread a blood-stained cloth with which Mohel had wiped his hands over the synagogue entrance. And Jewish polemicists, such as Yosef Kimchi, claimed that circumcision inoculated the Jews against violent and aggressive behavior. For Christian polemicists, in contrast, circumcision literally embodied the violent nature of Jewish difference. Even its technical details were subject to Christian exegesis and interpretation. For the 13th century Iberian polemicist Raymond Martini, the practice of metzitza, the sucking of blood from the child's wound after circumcision, represented both symbolically and literally the punishment of the Jews for their rhetorical violence against Christianity. Because of this custom, Martini claimed, I quote, that most abominable mouth, which quite often has blasphemed the Lord Jesus Christ, is infected and punished, end of quote. Claims of interpretive authority over Jewish ritual raised by Jewish converts to Christianity were inextricably linked to medieval anti-Jewish libels, and the interpretations produced within this framework consistently underlined the violent and threatening essence of Jewish religious practice. thus preparing fertile ground for future disseminations of blood libels. These trends are clearly reflected in Sefer Nitzachon, a popular and widely disseminated polemical text written by Yom Tov Lipman Mühlhausen, a rabbi active in Prague and Erfurt at the turn of the 15th century. Mühlhausen's treatise is by no means an exclusively anti-Christian polemic. Throughout his work, he addresses arguments of different groups of unorthodox dissenters, though the refutation of Christian exegesis plays a prominent role in this text. At the end of the treatise, Mühlhausen records a disputation he held with a Jewish convert to Christianity, Peter, also known by his Jewish name, Pesach. This debate did not occur in the context of a ritual murder accusation. Rather, it seems to have been connected with an accusation of a host desecration, perhaps the one taking place in Poznan in 1399. However, the debate between Mühlhausen and Peter is focusing almost entirely on Jewish prayer and ritual and the interpretation of its hidden meaning. Peter focused in particular on the Aleinu prayer, perhaps reflecting its growing importance in Jewish liturgy, which, as Israel Yuval has suggested, in turn mirrored Christian liturgical practice. He interpreted different parts of the prayer as veiled references and insults to Jesus, the Catholic priests, and royal authority. He also claimed that the Jewish ritual burning of challah is a mockery of the Eucharist. Mühlhausen's reply to these accusations consisted of exegetical counterarguments, combined with an attempt to present Jewish prayer as taking part in a wider critique of contemporary religious abuses, such as excessive image worship, a motif he believed could resonate in early 15th century Central Europe. Only a single veiled reference to blood libel appears in Sefer Nitzachon, commenting on a biblical verse that likens Israelites to a lion that does not rest till it devours its prey and drinks the blood of its victims, from the book of Numbers. Mühlhausen mentions other verses that refer to devouring or consuming of victims. But his response is almost playful. He claims that devouring in this context refers to conquest, persecution, and total destruction, because, I quote, "it would be impossible to devour all the enemies of the Jews." The drinking of blood, damim, mentioned in the verse, in his opinion, actually refers to plunder of money. With the benefit of hindsight, Mühlhausen's rejoinder may almost seem inadequate. He challenged the exegetical expertise of his interlocutor, but did not attempt to leave the domain of biblical hermeneutics. Yet Christian fantasies of Jewish rituals' true meaning, stirred by the authoritative pronouncements of former insiders, were no longer a hermeneutical exercise. As Professor Magda Teter's books eloquently shows, in the next centuries, it truly became a pan-European myth. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Milan, for an engaging presentation and taking us back into medieval times. Our next speaker is Dr. Sophia Schmidt. Dr. Schmidt received her PhD at the Ludwig Maximilians University in Munich last year, and she wrote about a blood libel. She wrote about a blood libel accusation in Regensburg, the city that she focuses her research on. She is currently a postdoctoral fellow at the Ludwig Maximilians University in Munich and also a researcher in the German Israel Foundation for Science, Research and Development, a project on responsa and archival records from medieval Ashkenaz. Dr. Schmidt was also a fellow at the Center for the Study of Conversion last year. Sophia, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak about blood libel. One of the aspects I enjoyed most about reading Magda Teter's book is the virtuosity with which she depicted the ritual murder trial of Trent at the end of the 15th century as a focal point between the medieval and the early modern narrative of blood libels. the book highlights both the continuity of such narratives and the targeted use of their abilities to adapt to new circumstances and worldviews by parties interested in fueling the accusation in what Magda Teter called the creation of a vicious feedback loop. One of the direct outgrowth of the Trent blood libel trial was an intricately connected allegation in Regensburg that, as Effie mentioned, was the focus of my dissertation project. Admittedly, it did not have the same resounding effects as the Trent case, but nevertheless, this allegation was received in early modern chronicles, on Baroque murals, and in the infamous collection of medieval blood libel cases that the Nazi press deemed supporting evidence for their anti-Semitic campaigns. Having expressed his interest in the Trent case on his travels to Rome, the Bishop of Regensburg had passed through Trent again on his way back to Regensburg in 1476. There, he was given a copy of some of the trial records, especially the confession of a convert named Wolfgang or Israel prior to his conversion. Questioned under torture by the Trent inquisitorial authorities about other blood libels he's been privy to, Wolfgang Israel describes a similar event in Regensburg. With these records in tow, the bishop returned to Regensburg, where he consulted the city authorities and Ludwig IX, Duke of Bavaria Landshut. They did not give up their hope to continue the trial against the accused Jews. In contrast to the Prince Bishop of Trent, however, the city council failed to establish a cult or a compelling narrative that could have been the basis for a supra-regional propaganda effort like in Trent. Negotiations and pressure against municipal authorities instead led to the release of the prisoners and their property in exchange for a hefty ransom fee after 4 years in 1480. This effort was spearheaded by the Jewish community and supported by its allies who were successful in positioning a counter-narrative against the city's allegations. It is this counter-narrative that I want to put into the focus of my remarks today, which could be considered a prequel to Magda Teter's examination of the responses to different blood libel accusations in the early modern period from a Jewish perspective. Regarding the Middle Ages, Magda Teter and Israel Yuval have argued that the internal writings of Ashkenazi Jews reflect very little on the allegations, and if they do, then the responses are mostly found in poetry or liturgical texts and focus on the martyrdom of the accused Jews. Beyond these exceptions, the defense was left to the Christian imperial or papal authorities, most famously represented in the privilege of Frederick II in 1236 in response to the blood libel accusations against the Jews of Fulda. Like papal bulls that tackled the same issue, the persecution of Jews was interdicted, the allegation that Jews needed blood for their rituals was dismissed, but with very little reference to the concrete accusation. The document I will present today as the basis for my analysis of the counter-narrative in Regensburg should be located somewhere in between these realms. It's a letter directed to the papal emissary in the German Empire, Alexander, Bishop of Forli, asking him to support the imprisoned Jews. The context is clearly the Christian legal and political realm, as it is written in Latin, riddled with legal terms. The issuer is not named, as this document the document that we have is a copy produced by the city scribe, but is most likely one of the lawyers of the Jews mentioned in other documents of the time. While it cannot be conclusively determined whether the original author of the document was a Christian or a Jewish advocate, the Latin points towards a Christian. The numerous details about the injustices experienced by individual members of the Jewish community and the repeated phrase, "the Jews said," indicate, however, that the Jews were definitely involved in the composition of the text. This source therefore provides us with a glimpse into the defense mechanism and strategies and argumentations of the Jewish community and their supporters that was adapted to a Christian audience. On several occasions, The letter refers directly to articles of the accusation, seemingly reacting to a list of accusations and their proofs presented by the city council. Out of the different directions the argumentations in that 7-page document takes, I want to take a look at 3 different aspects in which, so I argue, the narrative of the accusation was attacked and a counter-narrative was forged. It highlights the Jewish perspective on the allegation, arguing on the personal dimension, the spatial dimension, and the factual dimension of the allegations. The document contains several additional arguments that I will leave aside here, especially the ones already familiar and established in this context, such as the references to previous papal and imperial decrees on, or the emphasis on the biblical prohibition for Jews to consume any kind of blood. When the city authorities had received the records of Wolfgang Israel's statement, they aimed to implement their relocation of the accusation to Regensburg by assigning the names of the alleged perpetrator that Wolfgang Israel had mentioned to Jews living in Regensburg. The Jews identified in that manner were then imprisoned and tortured for confessions. Simultaneously, the accusation of Trent continued to play an important role in the city's argumentation. It determined the questions used to interrogate the prisoners to construct a story similar to the successful Trent model. Additionally, and probably of greater importance, was its use as legal proof in the files sent out together with other documents, for instance, to the imperial court. Not only was the mention of Regensburg in the Trent confessions meant to support the city case, but the existence of the whole Trent affair was presented as proof for the truth of the blood libel accusations in general. In their plea, the Jewish community and their supporters rebut these attempts by the city authorities. Instead, they clearly locate the driving force of the accusation and the parties interested in the trial in Regensburg itself. The imprisonment is based on old hatred and envy the authorities hold against the Jews of Regensburg. According to the document, the city government has presented itself as enemies of the Jews. Already for some years, it had been launching attacks against the Jews, Regensburg Jews, that frightened men, women, and children for frivolous reasons. Additionally, the plea especially denounced the actions of Hans Notschärf, as city treasurer at the head of the government at the time, for his personal hatred against Jews, citing his publicly given statement, "I don't want to be called Hans Notschärf if I won't disparage the synagogue of the Jews," and providing additional examples of his uncustomary and unlawful treatment of individual Jews. This line of argumentation was supposed to prepare for the later detailed demonstration of the weakness of the city proofs. By linking the accusation with general anti-Jewish attitudes as motivation for the allegation, it suggests that it was independent of any potentially compelling evidence that the Jews that were brought against the imprisoned Jews. The sentiment was mirrored in inner Jewish documentation, although to make a different argument. In 1478, Rabbi Joseph Kalon, or Ma'arik, was asked about a discussion between the leadership of several Bavarian Jewish communities who wanted to obligate their members to participate in a collection of funds to help the Regensburg Jews. He argues with the hostile stance of the Christian population. All their thoughts and aspirations are directed towards attacking us, which in turn served for him to justify the demand of a payment from the members of the surrounding Jewish communities due to the certain expectation of damage that would also harm them. The depiction of a constant underlying threat to the Regensburg Jews was considered a useful argument to gain support from Jews and, by countering the city's attempts to portray the accusation in the context of a chain of similar recognized international events, from Christian supporters as well. After the 17 Jews were imprisoned, the Regensburg authorities decided to place the remaining members of the Jewish community under house arrest in the Jewish quarter and position soldiers around it. From their actions and from internal documentation, it is obvious that their main interest laid with the control over the Jewish property, which they feared would otherwise be brought out of the city by Jews trying to flee. Officially, that is vis-a-vis the emperor, however, they argued that the imprisoned Jews might reveal other alleged co-conspirators at a later time, which they then would need to be able to arrest effortlessly, effectively turning the Jewish quarter into an outdoor prison. The letter to the papal emissary likewise addresses the Jewish quarter as a spatial entity, but presents a very different interpretation. The emperor has reserved and conceded a special quarter in the city of Regensburg to the Jews who live there, which is colloquially called Jewish Quarter. It is free from outside influence and has received privileges and is exempted so that no one can command, prohibit, capture, or force the Jews without a special mandate from the emperor. The quarter is presented here as a privileged legal space that should be considered part of the imperial legal space. The letter echoes in this aspect the argumentation of Emperor Frederick III when he claimed in his claims against the city of Regensburg that the Jews should be released, as all Jews in the empire ultimately are under his jurisdiction. With this depiction of the Jewish quarter in this document, the defense of the Jews thus demands that not only the Jewish community with its members and possessions should be removed from municipal authority, but also the space of the quarter itself. Considering now the recipient of the letter, the papal emissary, the author seems to construct a privileged legal status within the Jewish quarter that is parallel to the cathedral close, the immunity assigned to the area immediately around the cathedral pertaining to people and spaces alike. This representation of the Jewish quarter as an exempted space countered the city's designation of the quarter as a prison. Both these approaches concentrate their perception of Jewish space in Regensburg on the Jewish quarter. The 17 directly accused Jews, however, were imprisoned outside the quarter, probably in the city hall prison. One of these Jews, Abraham ben Jacob, or Eberlein, in the German sources, wrote several verses about his time in prison. In these verses, he describes his capture on Pesach together with his co-religionists, the accusation that they desired Christian children, and then he speaks in some verses about the building of a sukkah that was not kosher. Now, I obviously cannot reconstruct how or whether he in fact built a sukkah while in prison, but taken together with the other descriptions of holidays he celebrated and the archival material that mentions the kosher food the prisoners received, I would argue that Abraham was claiming a Jewish space outside of the Jewish quarter. As opposed to the argumentative construction of a counterspace to the city's effort discussed before, we see here a performative act of marking a religious Jewish space against the crime that in the argumentation of the city was wrongfully depicted as part of the Jewish rights and religion. In several passages, the letter to the papal emissary tried to deconstruct evidence brought by the city emissaries as proof of the Jewish guilt. Among them, an examination of the bones allegedly found in the house of one of the Jews, an examination which was performed by 4 representatives of the medical profession, witnessed by 6 representatives of the authorities, and then confirmed by 2 notaries. The doctors declared that the bones brought before them were indeed the bones of 4 to 6 children. This approach to the bones is connected to the origin of the Regensburg accusation. As we learned that it was based on the records of Trent, it was not initially connected to a missing persons case in Regensburg, and as far as we know, the accusation never mentioned the names of the alleged victims. Instead, but 3 weeks after the first arrests, we hear about the findings of these bones. The consultation of medical experts was part of the inquiry in the inquisitional trials and used here to strengthen the weight of the evidence. Although the resulting document was added to the aforementioned file of evidence, this approach was apparently only partially successful. The letter to the papal emissary questions first the trustworthiness of the gravediggers in general, and then convincingly poses the question how, if, as the accusation had claimed, some of the murders had happened recently, the corpse of this recently happened murder could have been so far decomposed. Instead, the letter mentions that the people of Regensburg say the bones had been dug from the cemetery and were then buried in the house of the Jews. The internal city documentation confirms the existence of that rumor in Regensburg, and even a 16th century chronicler of Regensburg history mentioned that in his writing. Doubts about the allegation were present among the Jewish and Christian population of the city. As a consequence, the bones should not be used to strengthen the city's argument in Regensburg, and Regensburg, probably also as a result of this rumor, never developed a cult centered on these alleged murdered children. It is very likely that the defenders of the imprisoned Jews were not only replying with their own interpretation of the evidence, but also described precisely how the bones had unsurfaced. This letter to the papal emissary presents a multifaceted approach to defend the Regensburg Jews against the allegations of blood libel. Besides appealing to the papal protection granted to Jews based on Augustine's doctrine of the Jews as witnesses and to previous papal refutations of blood libel accusations, the document confronts specific aspects of the accusations and their proofs, and counters it with their own interpretation of motivations, spaces, and alleged evidence. The focus is on legal arguments, and the authors seem to expect that the recipient of the letter would look favorably on their depiction and adapted them to this purpose. Some of the arguments are also visible in inner Jewish writings, so that the counter-narrative presented here is a reflection on a Jewish-Christian defense strategy. It also indicates that justice for the imprisoned Jews was thought to be possible if the counter-narrative was powerful enough. And now comes the but. As far as I know, we do not have a response to this letter. As opposed to the Trent case, the Pope did hardly intervene in Regensburg, and thus I cannot prove whether this document had any influence on the subsequent release of the imprisoned Jews in 1480. However, I hope I could still convince you that this letter is worth analyzing as a representative of a medieval counter-narrative to the so very resilient blood libel myth. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sophia, for a very, very engaging and thought-provoking presentation. And I hand over the platform to Professor Miri Rubin, who I introduced at the beginning, and unfortunately she missed that introduction. I'm
sure you said very good things. You're a good friend.
I tried my best. So without further ado,
sure,
Professor Miri Rubin.
So at the end, everyone has said such wonderful things, not least in the recapitulation by Magda and of course our two wonderful commentators. Still, I feel that an overview of the project and its historical meanings is maybe interesting and useful. So I'll start by saying this is a book of great commitment and learning. It's a patient book which takes its time. Although it's very clearly written and argued, this 500-page book is not an easy read. Why should it be? But it rewards perseverance. Magda Teter undertakes what no other scholar has done before, to closely observe and identify a whole trajectory over 600 years or so, with its modulations, of the European fascination with the possibility that Jews whom they knew well, often long-standing neighbors and business partners, would violently attack a child, usually a boy, in satisfaction of ritual needs and in the expression of innate evil. It is in that sense a European, Christian, Gentile tale, but it is also firmly part of Jewish experience. The useful map at the beginning of the book that shows, and which of course Magda re-explained, which is showing the map of the occurrences and how really few cases there were, and how few cases that actually went to trial and ended in accusations. That map shows that such accusations led to trials and executions in rather few cases over the centuries. But the very presence of the accusation, its truth value within some social landscapes through visual and literary representation, became part of the worlds Jews inhabited. It created a toxic environment around Jews, children, and especially in those parts of the year when liturgical agitation, excitation, and collective worship were at their most heated, Easter, Passover. While several attempts have been made by historians in recent decades to bring academic rigor to this emotional and fraught subject matter, no one until Magda Teter has studied the blood libel through its precise lines of transmission through really a genealogical method in a way, and over really the longue durée. She begins with the case of William of Norwich from the 1150s, our first known occasion when the accusation of child murder was put together as narrative, and traces the story's arrival first in France, then in towns like Fulda in the Rhineland and Valréas in the Vaucluse, where Jews were accused and tried. Jews' petitions resulted in intervention by those who were in a position to affect their well-being, emperors, popes. The Pope's positions are interesting indeed, as we've heard again and again, and just now, Innocent IV in 1244 was able to distinguish between the perfidy of the Jews, their blindness in which he wholly believed, and accusations of cannibalistic child murder that had no basis in fact, according to him. This is when and where Magda Teter's exploration becomes particularly interesting and original. For if the support for ritual murder accusations was not official policy, its spread would depend on the agency of powerful local actors, what she just called in her presentation, leadership. Hers becomes as much a study of ecclesiastical politics and governance as it is a chapter in anti-Judaism. She rightly spends a great deal of time on that case which straddles sensibilities usually thought of as either medieval or early modern, and shows this distinction to be void. I mean, of course, the case of Simon of Trent of 1475. For although this was by now, the ritual murder accusation was by now an old medieval story, as it were, it was enacted in Trent through rigors that were modern indeed. The activist humanist Bishop Hinderbach, who promoted the case, had at his disposal energized and mobilized friars whose religious orders were quite remade in the 15th century, re-energized in the case of the Dominicans by the invention of that new heresy, diabolical witchcraft, and adept at setting up trials in the regions of today's Switzerland and Eastern France to extirpate that new heresy. While the Duke of Tyrol and the Emperor and the Pope were petitioned to oppose the case, the bishop and his entourage, supported by local Trentini, saw the trial unfold, the torture delivered, the confessions collected, and the new cult born. Here, the newest technologies of print, woodcut, combinations of plurilingual narratives served to spread the news faster than any earlier ritual murder accusation. While in the 12th century, the news from Norwich spread laboriously in manuscripts, and thanks to the workings of the Cistercian news network, by the 15th century, the pamphlets of Trent were several, spread throughout Europe, and the related images entered into the most influential histories and chronologies of the day. In the case of Trent, Magda Teter combines with Romy Shah before her in demonstrating the differing and vying levels of action against Jews, and this theme she continues to develop in the book's following chapters. I was particularly taken by Magda Teter's demonstration of how the Reformations refigured that the truth value attached to the blood libel and its political meanings. For the tale was soon mobilized in the powerful polemical fields that stretched between Catholics and Protestants. It was inserted into the all-influential annals of Baronius, the new authoritative Catholic papal history of the Church. She also introduces to us a series of Central European polemical writers and chroniclers of great interest, who absorbed from this culture of knowledge, as she calls it very helpfully, the narrative of ritual murder born centuries earlier and far to the west. There is here cultural production by friars and urban laymen alike, facilitated by Catholic reference books like the Annals. This Catholic Reformation encouraged across Europe the rewriting of hagiographies spurned by Protestants, that is, old hagiographies spurned now by and derided by Protestants, as Philip Zorgel and Virginia Reinberg have shown in various studies, and promoted the collection of the writing of new hagiographies and collections of new martyrologies, now accompanied by prints and woodcuts. William of Norwich was rediscovered in this way. We saw the image that Magda showed. Indeed, in England too, he was even rediscovered by recusant Catholics like William Howard, who early in the 17th century had a bead added to his rosary, a bead engraved with the figure of his namesake, little William. In this world of polemic of the later 16th century, Jewishness and affinity to Jews became a touchstone of Christian probity, as between Protestants of various hues and Catholics. Teter introduces us to the Polish writer Przemysław Mojecki, whose 1598 Żydowskie okrucieństwa, mordy I zabobony. I have actually studied Polish in recent years. Cruelty, Murders, and Superstitions of the Jews was a leader in the genre, which Alfonso da Spina had already, of course, perfected in the 15th century. And so when a boy, like 4-year-old Wojciech, disappeared in Świniarów, Jews were accused in the royal tribunal. The knowledge was there now. Here was the first case of many in these lands, of several in these lands. A trial and conviction followed. When a century later, a case unfolded famously in Sandomierz, a contemporary author noted that this was a case in a series that had begun in Świniarów. So the ritual murder story unfolds as a puzzle, as a set of opportunities, and a pragmatic challenge to men involved in setting ecclesiastical priorities, authorizing anti-Jewish feeling and action. Although townspeople often form part of the action, they seem to me led rather than leaders. There is also a whole hinterland of which we will know little, of all those many accusations that did not happen, that were quashed, that never went beyond rumors. I'm reminded here of an article of about 40 years ago by Ilana Luria about a case, I think, of 1301 in Iberia. But again, the cases that don't lead to anything, that leaves sources. So there must have been a whole hinterland of accusations, attempted accusations that never went beyond rumors. The full unfolding, ugly, painful, contaminating of a ritual murder accusation unto punishment was rare, yet the very rumor was noxious. Magda Teter's book identifies the fomenters of these hateful narratives, those who chose to promote the disruptive and the dehumanizing libel that made familiar Jews into dangerous foes. And I still take heart at the small number of accusations and trials. So as you see, I enjoyed the book very much, and I thank you, Magda, for your work, your care, and your intelligent scrutiny, all combined in this volume. If there was one point I would just like to make to encourage discussion, and in the spirit of a sort of, maybe not Begriffsgeschichte, but some sort of philological or linguistic tracing of meanings, I still think we have to be quite careful in the uses that we make of libel, of ritual murder, of murder accusations, of cannibalism, and so on.
I've always been a minimalist in these things, and I don't call, I never called the text from Norwich a sort of ritual murder, I don't think. And I think it's quite important, actually, to attend to the terminologies, not only of the time, but even the analytical terms that we use, because as you show, there is an historical development of what pertains to the story, and that needs to be also reflected in our linguistic analytical apparatus. But that's just a point we may want to pick up. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That's true.
Thank you.
Really fantastic.
Thank you, Mary. We have just a few more moments before we adjourn. So Magda, I hand it over to you if you want to address any of the comments made by either Mary or Sophia or Milan. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And these were really, really wonderful. Thank you for your time, for your thought. And I'll just say that, you know, some of the points that you made, I'll go as Milan and Sophia and Miri. I think the point, Milan, that you make in the discussion of the expert knowledge is really key here, and the uses and misuses of that expert knowledge, how it can be used, Jews and the converts are used to access certain knowledge. And then, of course, the expert knowledge plays such an important role in how that story, those tales are disseminated. And one of the points that I make in the book, that it's contrary to what we've been told for decades, that it's not really the rabble, the uneducated, it's the intellectuals who are disseminating, who are perpetuating the story at the clearest, at least the evidence that I've seen. Sophia, again, I can't go to many the points that and examples that you've given, but I think the Regensburg case is very interesting because it points out to the role of individuals in history. That is, you have it's just not far away from Trento. It's directly linked to Trento, but the story ends very differently. And one of the reasons is that you don't have Hinderbach, who is really committing money, energy, and marshaling artists and everybody else around him to his cause. And I mean, there's this political thing, we can talk about the differences, but I think that's one of the important points. And also to the genre of sources that we have, right? That is, we have certain narratives that are produced for courts, I have certain narratives that are produced internally for mourning victims and things like that. And these stories might have different places. Your example of the counter narrative reminded me of the materials from Viterbo, where it's a very clear way that Rabbi Korkos knows how to speak this sort of legal language and which points to touch. So that was a wonderful example. Miri, thank you so much for this generous your comments. And I think one of the things that struck me, and that's something that I kept saying, this has to be investigated more, is the role of the religious orders in this whole tale. So early on is the Cistercians. Then, as you point out, it's Dominicans and Franciscans that are playing a role. In the early modern period, the Jesuits, I mean, they are the ones who are writing these books and publishing these books, and these are the ones who are marshaling the knowledge. So there is this whole story to be written about the role of religious orders in disseminating the story. And the final point that you make about the libel murder, ritual murder, I agree with you. On my website, if you notice, on the maps, it says murder libel. I don't say ritual murder accusations. I say it's a murder libel because exactly the language implies certain role of Jewish ritual, which it doesn't have in the murder accusation, right? So that's I also agree that this is important to pay attention how we speak about it. And even though the language might be kludgy and difficult, like said to have done and things like that, it's very important to use it because you don't want as I kept giving it in the back of my mind after the Ariel Toaf affair, you don't want quotes to be taken out and said Jews killed somebody in somewhere. Teter says that because, you know, I'm quoting something. So I was trying to be very, to the chagrin of my editors, to be very insistent on how careful anything. And your work on William of Norwich is really, you know, being this very careful analysis and contextualization of William's story was very important. So I don't have more time, but it was wonderful to hear these, and thank you for your time for this.
I want to thank you all for your comments, your thoughts, for sharing your ideas with us, and for reading the book so carefully and discussing it. I want to thank the audience for attending, and I would like to invite you for our future programming. You can follow us on our website. It's in the Ben-Gurion University website. And if you want, please be in touch with our administrator, Raya Evan David, and she will put you on our newsletter, and you'll be able to access both what we do and future programming that we share with the public. So I thank you all, and I bid you good night. Thank you, Magda.
Thank you. And I just put my email if anybody wants to get in touch with me in the chats. Thank you so much for your time and for having me. I know we were supposed to do it last year in person, but
this is
thank
perfect.
you.
This is perfect. Thank you very much.
So much. Thank you. That was
Good night,
delightful.
everyone. תודה רבה.
תודה.
Thank you.